It's London, 1910. The city is the undisputed financial capital of the world. More than 70% of all global trade is financed by British pounds, sterling Germany, however, is building steel faster than Britain. Its economy is growing at a rate of 47% per year, while Britain's is at 22%. A war between them seems impossible. Their economies are completely intertwined. Their royal families are literally cousins. Yet just 4 years later, 20 million people would be dead, and the world would be changed forever. We are told this war was started by an assassin's bullet, but the bullet was just the excuse. The real story is about the fuel, the money, and the men who controlled it. To understand what is happening in our world today, we have to go back to the bankers who engineered the first modern forever war. Before 1914, the world was on a system called the gold standard. It was simple. Every major currency, the British pound, the German mark, the French franc, was backed by a fixed amount of physical gold. This system was run by a small interconnected group of international banking families. You had the Rothschilds in London and Paris, the Warburgs in Hamburg, the Morgans in New York. These men weren't just bankers. They were global powers. They financed railroads in America, canals in Egypt, and mines in South Africa. They believed war was primitive. They believed it was bad for business. After all, you can't have stable trade when countries are sinking each other's ships. But this belief was about to be tested because a new power was rising that threatened their entire system. That power was the German Empire. After unifying in 1871, Germany had become an industrial titan. Its factories were newer and more efficient than Britain's. Its merchant fleet was second only to the Royal Navy. And it had a terrifying plan, the Berlin to Baghdad Railway. This railway would give Germany a direct land route to the oil fields of the Middle East. It would bypass the British-controlled Suez Canal. It would break the British naval blockade on global trade for the City of London, the financial hub of the British Empire. This was not just competition, it was an existential threat. Britain's long-standing foreign policy was called the balance of power. It meant that no single nation on the European continent could be allowed to become dominant. Germany was becoming dominant, and it had to be stopped. But here's where it gets interesting. How do you stop an economic giant? You don't challenge it directly, you encircle it. In school, we learn about the Triple Entente, the alliance between Britain, France, and Russia that formed before the war. We're taught it was a defensive alliance, but let's look at the money. France and Germany were bitter rivals. Russia and Britain were rivals for control of Asia. Yet suddenly these enemies became friends. Why? Starting in 1906, French banks began pumping billions of francs into Tsarist Russia. This wasn't for economic development, it was for railroads. Railroads that led directly to the German border. It was for munitions factories. It was a massive military buildup financed by Parisian bankers to create a second front that could crush Germany from the east. The bankers were drawing the battle lines 8 years before the first shot was fired. But there was one major piece missing from the board: the United States. In 1900, the U.S. was a rising industrial power, but it was fiercely isolationist. It had no interest in Europe's ancient quarrels. More importantly, from the bankers' perspective, it had a major problem. It did not have a central bank. There was no single entity that could create money out of thin air to finance a massive war. The nation's money supply was inflexible, tied to gold, and managed by thousands of independent commercial banks. This all changed in 1907. A financial panic known as the Knickerbocker Crisis rocked Wall Street. The system froze. It was J.P. Morgan, the man, not the bank, who personally stepped in. He locked the country's top bankers in his library and forced them to pool their money to stop the collapse. Morgan single-handedly saved the U.S. economy. And in doing so, he proved the bankers' key point. America needed a lender of last resort, a central bank. This set the stage for one of the most secretive meetings in American history. In November 1910, a group of men boarded a sealed train car in New Jersey. They were told to use only their first names. They represented 25% of the entire world's wealth. There was Senator Nelson Aldrich, father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr. There was Paul Warburg from the Warburg banking dynasty of Germany. There were men representing J.P. Morgan and Kuhn Loeb and Co. They traveled to a private club on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. For 9 days, they hammered out a plan. That plan was the Federal Reserve Act. They were creating a central bank for bankers by bankers. It was presented to Congress as a way to stabilize the economy and prevent panics. It was passed into law on December 23, 1913. Most of Congress had already gone home for Christmas. The United States now had a financial mechanism, a money printer capable of funding a world war. This was 7 months before the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, June 28, 1914. A Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip shoots the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. This is the spark. We all know this story. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia. Serbia's protector mobilizes its army. Germany allied with Austria. Hungary declares war on Russia. France allied with Russia declares war on Germany. Germany invades Belgium to outflank France. Britain, outraged by the violation of Belgian neutrality, declares war on Germany. It all looks like a tragic, unavoidable domino effect. But here's the question you should be asking. Where did they get the money? Austria needed money to punish Serbia. Russia needed money to mobilize its 12 million-man army. Germany needed money to back Austria. France needed money to execute its Plan 17 invasion. All of them, every single one, got their funding from the same small circle of international banks. The war was on. Now the focus shifts to America. President Woodrow Wilson declared the U.S. neutral in thought as well as in deed. But his chief advisor, Colonel Edward House, was deeply connected to the Wall Street bankers. Almost immediately, the House of Morgan went to work. J.P. Jack Morgan, Jr., who had inherited the empire, met with the British ambassador. He was appointed the sole purchasing agent for the British Empire in the United States. A few months later, France signed the same deal. This meant every bullet, every bushel of wheat, every roll of barbed wire the Allies bought in America went through one bank, J.P. Morgan and Co. Morgan took a 1% commission on all of it. He arranged for $3 billion in goods to be shipped to the Allies. That's over $80 billion in 2025 dollars. The U.S. economy, which had been in a mild recession, began to boom. Unemployment vanished. Factories ran 24/7. The entire American economy was being retooled to fuel the Allied war machine. Retention hook, error, or 8 men mark. But there was a problem by late 1916. Britain and France were running out of money. They had liquidated their overseas investments. They had shipped tons of gold to New York, and they were still losing. The war had bogged down into a bloody stalemate in the trenches of France. The bankers had a serious issue. They had loaned the Allies $500 million directly, about $13 billion today. The $3 billion in trade was also financed on credit. If the Allies lost, or even if the war ended in a stalemate, those debts would never be repaid. J.P. Morgan and Co. would be ruined. Wall Street would collapse. The entire U.S. economic boom would vanish overnight. American neutrality was no longer profitable. It was now a financial liability. The bankers needed America to enter the war, not just to loan the Allies money, but to give it to them. And the only way to do that was to get the UG's Treasury involved. President Wilson, who had won re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," now had to find a reason to get in. The public pretext came quickly. Germany, desperate to stop the flow of American supplies to Britain, declared unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917. This meant they would sink any ship, including American passenger ships heading to Britain. Then the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted by British intelligence. It was a message from Germany to Mexico, proposing an alliance if the U.S. entered the war. The media, heavily influenced by banking interests who owned major newspapers, whipped up a storm of public outrage. The Lusitania had been sunk back in 1915, killing 128 Americans. But now was the right time. On April 2, 1917, Wilson went before Congress. He didn't say we had to save J.P. Morgan's balance sheet. He said we must fight to make the world safe for democracy. The U.S. Army, then smaller than Portugal's, swelled to 4 million men. The new Federal Reserve, along with new income tax laws, financed the effort. The U.S. government extended $10 billion in credit to the Allies. This money wasn't a loan from Morgan. It was a loan from the American taxpayer funneled through Morgan to the Allies. The Allies then used this money to buy more goods from Morgan. It was the perfect financial loop, climax. The war ended 19 months later, on November 11, 1918. The numbers are staggering: 20 million dead, another 21 million wounded. The Austro-Hungarian Empire gone, the Ottoman Empire gone, the Russian Tsarist Empire gone, the German Empire gone. Europe was a smoldering ruin. And the winners? The bankers. At the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, the German delegation wasn't just facing politicians. They were facing the bankers. J.P. Morgan's top partners, Thomas Lamont and Paul Warburg, were there, advising the U.S. delegation. They are the ones who calculated the final reparations bill. Germany was ordered to pay $33 billion, over $500 billion today. It was a sum so impossibly large it guaranteed Germany would be in debt for generations, a debt that would crush its new democracy, a debt that would directly lead to the hyperinflation of 1923, a debt that would create the anger and resentment that 20 years later would fuel an even deadlier war. And what about America? In 1914, the United States was a debtor nation. It owed the world $3 billion. By 1919, it was a creditor nation. The world owed it $12 billion. The center of global finance had shifted permanently from London to New York. The U.S. dollar, backed by the Federal Reserve, was on its way to becoming the new king. So, which brings us back to the original question, did a cabal of bankers secretly start World War I? No, they didn't have to. They just built the system. They funded the 10-year arms race. They created the rival economic blocs. They financed the opposing alliances. They created the central bank mechanism to fund the machine. And when their investments were at risk, they ensured the neutral. United States would enter the war to guarantee the outcome. They didn't fire the shot. They just built the powder keg, sold the fuse, and then collected the insurance payment on the explosion. A regional conflict became a global catastrophe, and a handful of men made $200 billion from the slaughter. Call to action. This was the blueprint. It changed warfare from a battle of armies to a battle of economies. So here is the question for us today. Was World War I a unique tragic event? Or was it the model for how global finance uses conflict to manage economic cycles and global power? Do you think the system has truly changed? Or are we just living inside a more complex version of the same machine? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And subscribe, because in our next video we're going to examine the one man who saw this coming and the one banker who tried to stop it all.